Today's episode of Socially Democratic is now available on Patreon. Join our community on Patreon for free or for as little as $2.50 a month, and you can help support the show. When you sign up as a campaign organiser, you get access to our premium episodes and a free ticket to a live show, and you get the Haters Hate and the Rest Vote Labor merch. And we'd like to thank our latest member, Jake, for joining our Patreon community. Today's episode's brought to you by Dunn. Dunn is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. We develop community engagement strategies to win campaigns both big and small. We train engagement staff and volunteers in the Marshall Gantz framework of leadership, organising and action. And if you want to create change in your community, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. Murray Bees has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years, and they've helped over 500,000 people get the compensation they deserve. And if you've been injured at work or on the road, then you may have a claim through your superannuation. So for expert and empathetic legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the folks leading them from home and abroad. And it is now December, and we're going to begin this journey of our end-of-year review, starting with federal politics. And we're going to be joined on the show today by the member for Lilly, Anika Wells, and the member for Macnamara, Josh Burns, who are good friends of the podcast, who have been on. We do this pretty much every year. So looking forward to having a chat with those two wonderful people. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the show, then give us a review and some stars on Apple Podcast or whatever. And for everything else, don't forget to follow Socially Democratic on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and we're now on Blue Sky as well, which is like the non-Nazi version of Twitter. All right, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Monday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. It is early December, and we have begun our episodes where we review the year. And this is our federal politics year in review. Historically, we do this every year, but we missed last year for some reason. I can't remember. These people are very, very busy, but we're very grateful for their time once again.
I will return to the end as to why I missed it last year, Stephen.
I flew to Canberra.
Tantalise your listeners to stay into the end.
Okay, right. As you can hear, the voice,
what a book,
the dulcet tones of the member for Lilly and the Minister for Aged Care and Sport, Anika Wells. Welcome back to Socially Democratic. Wonderful to have you again.
Good to be with you. Apologies for last year. Back with a vengeance this year.
Good. And just across the river is the member for Macnamara and the Minister for the Ministry of Sound, Josh Burns. Welcome back to Social Democratic.
You know, I used to have the Ministry of Sound CDs, like the John Corson Grand Smiley ones, because
no one is surprised by this.
They had their residencies in Macnamara, can I just say.
Right. I picked you as a Ministry of Sound kind of guy.
Prince. No, I wasn't really a Ministry of Sound guy. But One Love as well. Like, that was all my era. You know, most people who are listening to this will go, what the hell is this guy talking about?
I reckon some people know about the Ministry of Sound. Everyone bought those CDs. Remember the Chill Out albums that came out in the summer?
Yeah, they were good.
Yep. That's peak St Kilda right there. All right. Lots to talk about. Year in review. We've picked a bunch of topics that happened throughout the year. I don't even know if I'm going to do them chronologically. I think I'm just going to throw them out there and get some reflections from our two wonderful guests. Let's start with the big thing that happened this year, I think, in the middle of the year, which is ending the stage 3 tax cuts. A big decision by the government, controversial. Josh Burns, to you first of all, how significant was that announcement for the government and for the people of our great nation?
Well, I think that when making these sorts of political decisions, you have to weigh up what's right and what you believe in, and then clearly there was going to be an assault by the Liberal Party and the Murdoch Empire and a whole range of different other stakeholders who were going to complain about this and make this into something that it wasn't. But I think it was a really good call by the Prime Minister, because in the end, the reason why I think we got through it was because it was about what was right, and it was about all of us coming together and saying, no, actually, we need to do what's right, we need to do what's fair, we need to do what's right for our people. And that means that instead of weighting these tax cuts to the higher income earners, we spread them out and make sure that everyone gets a reduction in their income tax contributions, and B, that they are more evenly weighted across the sort of lower and middle income band. So I think it was the right decision. I think it took the Liberals a little bit of time to work out exactly how to manage it, because we were arguing what was the right and the justifiable position, and they were arguing what wasn't the justifiable position. And in the end, it did prove that good policy can be good politics. And the Liberal Party, initially said that they would scrap them, then they would oppose them, then we should call an election on them. And now Peter Dutton's announced that he wouldn't do the original stage 3 tax cut. So they've been completely all over the shop. I think the Prime Minister played a really clever and principled stance on this, and we got the right outcome. And people should check their tax returns and go and get them done and get a bigger tax return than they would have otherwise.
Anika, you're in a marginal seat up in the northern suburbs of Brisbane. How has this announcement this year gone down with the good burgers of Lily?
I'd make the point, firstly, that you're right, they kicked in 1 July, but this was the first out of the blocks move of the Albanese Labor government for 2024. We love the PM. He loves working in January. I'm Minister for Sport. I love working in January. Jim Chalmers never stops working. And this was how we came out of the blocks in 2024 and said, LFG coalition, we're here and we're going to do things in a way that you're going to find very difficult in 2024. And that's sort of what Josh was speaking to. The LNP have been all over the shop on this all year. And when we are in a cost of living crisis and people are feeling pain in households, this was one of those ones where we had to deliberate, taking some paint off ourselves on the way through, because it was changing our position. The press gallery was very live to the fact that we'd be changing a position, weighing up the paint that we would take off for that decision against actually doing everything we can to help people in pain. And I think the good burgers of Lily, they're not idiots. They know that there's a global inflationary crisis. They know that we're dealing with some things in the economy that are not of our making, but that are making life hard for everybody. But they do want to know that the people they elect are doing absolutely everything they can to help them. And I think the changes to the stage 3 tax cuts that we announced in January and rolled out in 1 July are our best example of that. And I look forward to continuing to campaign on them in the months to come.
Josh, Anika just mentioned one of the things that a lot of voters are experiencing right now, which obviously is the cost of living pressures. It's an issue that has really been now hanging around for the good part of 2 years. We were talking about this last year, I think, when you were on the show. Just talk to us about how the government has sought to try and manage this particular issue, because it still resonates with voters, and obviously this will be in front of minds when they go to the polls at some stage next year.
Well, inflation is a terrible thing, and it really hurts the lower and middle income earners way worse, and especially when interest rates have been increased, it hurts people who are either renting or trying to pay off a mortgage. And so inflation is a really wicked and terrible economic thing to confront. And the reason why it's also so wicked is because the way to deal with it is not to give people money that would potentially make inflation worse, but rather find ways to bring down inflation and find the ways in which inflation is actually biting, and also supporting people who really need it at the time. So it is an extremely difficult problem to be able to work through. And I think when you look at some of the measures that have been introduced, when you look at specific payments that go directly off one's power bill, so that instead of giving a cash transfer to someone, it just means that the power bills are going to be $300 less when you receive them. Something like that actually means that your power bills are lower, inflation is lower, and that means people have more money to do other things. I thought that was a really smart move by Chris Bowen and Jim Chalmers and the Prime Minister, obviously. I also think that when you look at, well, what are the essentials, right? What are the things that we don't want people making decisions on, whether or not they can afford them in this time, to halve the cost of medicines and to ensure that people can go to the pharmacy less frequently and get the scripts that they need. I thought that the 60-day dispensing and the half price of medicines, capping the PBS amount, I thought that was, again, another one of those examples where instead of doing something that potentially makes inflation worse or prolongs inflation, it actually just reduces the cost of things that we know are essential. We know that people need energy. We know that people need medicines. And then when you look at the other things that I think are really clever is around our student debt and lowering student debt, because that was accumulating, and we don't want people to be punished by a high inflationary figure. So what Jason Clare did was ensure that the interest on student debt was always the lowest possible amount, because inflation when inflation was low, it basically meant that student debt was a really low interest rate. So I think those sorts of things have been really responsible and really considered policies that actually look at, well, how do we not make this worse, but how do we support people during this? And amazingly, all of them have been opposed by the Liberal Party. All of the cost of living measures that support people during this period have been opposed by the Liberal Party, which is so galling, because that they like to complain about it, but they're actually not helping. So how do you get through inflation? It's a really awful thing to confront, and you need to do it really carefully. And I think the measures that we've taken, it started with a 6 when we got into government, it's now got a 2, but the work is not done, and we need people to continue to be able to work through these economic issues and work through their household budgets, and people are struggling, and the work continues.
Anika, one of the things that I took away from the outcome in the US presidential election was that even though all the economic indicators or measurements of how the US economy was tracking was really, really positive. Inflation had come down. The US economy was humming again. And broadly speaking, economists were all saying, things are back on track post-COVID. But obviously the feeling on the ground amongst voters was things were still expensive. And I'm just wondering about the experience that's going on here in Australia right now, because as the things that Josh just listed, there's a lot of public policy that the government is enacting to try and deal with the cost of living pressures that voters are experiencing. And I'm wondering, is it a comms challenge now that we're going to have going into this election that, I don't know anecdotally if people are still saying, I still think things are really expensive. So is it more solutions from government from a policy standpoint, or is it actually, do we need just to communicate to folks that, hey, these are the things that we actually are doing. We understand what's going on. We hear you, and we're actually taking this really, really seriously, and we're doing a lot of these things. And so as long as you know that we're doing it, then maybe people will come around to the idea of, okay, Labor's actually got our best interests at heart. Because I think one of the things that got taken out of the, certainly during the Biden administration, was folks didn't know that the Biden administration was doing a lot of things to actually try and address the pressures that folks were feeling. I just want to get a sense of what have we learned from the US election that can be replicated here in Australia?
I think the same lesson in a different policy context that we saw in the Queensland election at the end of October, which is that law and order was a huge issue at the Queensland state election, despite the fact that the law and order stats were down, and that the crime stats, if you look at them as statistics, were down, but people did not feel safe. And that, so it was a question of how people felt rather than a question of a statistical argument. party versus party, in the same way that you're saying the economic figures in America were actually very good, but people didn't feel it. People were still hurting. So you can't just look safe. You've got to feel safe. You can't just academically understand that things are better if you are not feeling that in your household. So I guess my lesson from both of those examples, albeit in different policy spaces, is that it's not enough just to have a laundry list of all of your good efforts and all of your hard work. You've got to have a story. You've got to be speaking to a central narrative about what it is that you're trying to do and what it is that you'll do next. And that's what I know, all busy crafting up. And we'll see the MyEFO update out in a couple of weeks that will set some more of those signposting, I think, some more things in the works across the summer. And that's what I'm giving thought to as we go into the Christmas break, how we communicate our story.
Sticking with you, Anika, there's a lot of work being done from the government this year around early childhood workers, and I want to just get some reflections from you on that significant piece of legislation that was introduced. Obviously, this is an important area. I think we're actually in a couple of weeks' time, we've got Senator Jess Walsh on the show to talk about this actual campaign, which I'm excited about. But Anika, just talk us through some of give us the sort of the cliff notes on this wage justice for early childhood workers.
I think you may, in fact, be speaking about wage justice for early educators, Stephen, which passed the Parliament in the ferocious work of the final week of sitting. First of all, on a very personal level, I would like to thank the early educators who are teaching my children every single day when I am running around to all four corners of the country. It's far more than just changing nappies. It's instilling values. It's teaching them and the articulate little gentlemen that they're becoming. So a long overdue pay rise for people whose work has been chronically and systemically undervalued for decades, in the same way that the aged care workers that I am privileged to look after as the aged care minister also provide very complex work, nuanced work, and work that has been systemically and chronically undervalued. We just have not valued care in our country the way that we should. And I think that comes down to the types of people that perform that work. And I've been really proud to be part of a government that has addressed that. In aged care, the 15% pay rise came through last 1 July, so a fair whack earlier than this pay rise, which has started 1 December for our early educators. And the stories that I get to hear when I travel around, people are now able to apply for a home loan in a way that their salaries did not allow them to do so as aged care workers before. Someone told me there was all these bomby cars in the car park. Everyone was in cars that sort of were probably not roadworthy because they didn't have any money to fix them. And now those cars are getting repaired, which makes our aged care workers more able to return home safely at the end of the shift. Sort of life-changing stuff that we've been able to do, and I've been proud to help do it.
Fantastic. Can I also just one other thing that's happened just recently, and I think it's controversial. I think it's controversial because of various generations and their experience with social media. But obviously, this social media ban, I'm sure it's got a better name than that. But in my notes, that's what I've written down. For younger people, you're both parents, and but also lawmakers. And I want to get a sense. I'll go to you first, Anika, then I'll come to you, Josh. This legislation that's been introduced, a lot of digital natives hate it, but a lot of parents anecdotally are telling me they love it because they're fresh out of ideas about how to protect their kids when they're on social media with all the sort of the dark places of the internet. Anika, your thoughts on coming to introduce this legislation and what it's actually seeking to do?
I think from the fact it's been front page of the dailies so often this year and in the past couple of years suggests that we, not just as a cohort of parents, but as a society, feel like we're losing the war with social media. It feels completely out of our control at this point, and so much harm comes of it. Not just these sort of particularly tragic cases that the News Corp tabloids have highlighted, but just the deterioration in mental health of people, particularly post-COVID, and the way that online has contributed to that. I think people feel a sense of helplessness about what they can do in their family or their household to protect people. And so the idea that the federal government would write in to have their backs and to outlaw it in a way that hopefully triggers a conversation about why we've done that I can't, I've already had to say to my 7-year-old, I can't guarantee to keep you safe online. When she's asked me, what all of my other friends are in a messenger chat, why can't I be in the messenger chat? It's been a helpful thing to lean on. So I think more work to do, but an important part of us being there when it matters and having parents' backs.
Josh, you're a parent. What was going through your mind when the government was introducing this piece of legislation?
Well, obviously, I voted for it.
Obviously you voted for it, but I mean,
And we
still,
appreciate your support.
Yeah.
No, the thing I would add to Anika's answer is that I think that conversation that it triggers is a really important one, and that online is such a dark place right now. I mean, it is tearing away at the sort of social norms and the fabrics of society in a way that people are screaming at each other. Loud and hateful voices are having a platform. Social media platforms are not doing enough to moderate the content on their platforms. There is a black hole and an unresponsiveness in general around social media companies that, frankly, is meaning that really sort of dark aspects of society are having a very big influence very, very quickly. And I think that just like how media companies are regulated when they are broadcasting messages to millions of people, social media companies need to be regulated so that the content that they provide is safer for people, and obviously it's a different environment. But I do think that what the current status quo is not acceptable. In saying all of that, for a young person, and what we want young people who are actively going on to social media, and whether it's 14 or 16 now when they start, we want them to come to social media respectfully. We want people to engage respectfully. I do know that social media for a lot of young people can be a place where they actually feel less isolated. They're able to connect with people who are like-minded. I know that, my electorate, certainly some of the young queer community, feel like social media is where they are able to find their tribe and feel more accepted as part of a community. I also know that that people can connect and find help online and in social networks, and depending on what their experiences are, that can be a really important place of community. So I think this is a recognition that the current status quo is not acceptable. It needs to be safer for people, especially for young people. But at the same time, I also would definitely be encouraging families and parents and others to be having healthy conversations about engaging respectfully online, engaging respectfully with one another, what the risks are online, what sort of content's online. Are you contributing to a healthy dialogue, or are you contributing to someone's well-being in a positive way or in a negative way? And those sorts of conversations can't be dismissed. They're really important, and a law that the government brings in is not a replacement for them, but it may help with it.
When you talk about regulating the social media companies, and I agree with your point, what would that look like? Like, is it as simple as some basic things like, if you're going to have a social media account, it actually has to be you, as opposed to a whole bunch of anonymous accounts? And I know that will be upsetting for you, Josh, that you'll have to shut down all of your anonymous NBA accounts, where you go onto different pages and troll people for their team losing. But that's the sacrifice you have to make as a parliamentarian. But are they the kind of regulations that we're talking about?
Well, I do know that one of the complications that we have to think through is a registration of it, because there are a number of legitimate accounts that are not individual human accounts. They're accounts from an organisation. So, they are accounts that not profit or a company or and then therefore what is the threshold by which, if you're a registered not-for-profit or anyone can register as any organisation and you can register these accounts. So it does become a bit of a rabbit hole, and we want businesses to be able to have accounts, and we want people to be able to engage, and they become a part of local communities. So I do think that is an aspect of it, but certainly the sort of, the anonymous eggs on Twitter that are just out there spewing hate, as well as frankly the sort of content that gets put on there, which is complete misinformation, is outrageous and goes unchecked and unguarded. I mean, it's also. I mean, I've completely removed myself from X. It is a cesspool of racism and hate and bigotry that I have never experienced, and I can't go on there without reading just the most vile hate-filled comments. It's terrible. So I think social media companies are not responsive enough. They're not serious enough about the content that they have on their platforms, about the standards. They like to talk about providing a safe place and all of that, but the algorithms are evolving in a way that these platforms are becoming increasingly toxic, and I feel much better on a day where I'm not spending hours just on scrolling and looking at some of the content online.
Let's take it up a notch and talk something that's very positive, and that is something that is firmly in the space of the Minister for Sport. Australia, the Olympics were held this year in Paris, and we did quite well. Anika Wells, how proud are you as a Minister for Sport for the efforts that we saw from both our Olympians and Paralympians in Paris this year?
Oh, one of the great privileges and joys of the job to be the Australian Sports Minister in the midst of the Olympic and Paralympic cycle. What we tried to do was boost the funding, and we did boost the funding in record ways, almost $500 million over 2 years for high performance, and we doubled the Paralympic funding, doubled the previous amount, so now it's $55 million. And we did that in the run up to Paris because something that I heard from people is that when you get back from the games, it's actually really difficult for our athletes and the coaches and support staff that look after them. There's a huge come down, lack of routine after building to something across a 4-year cycle. People actually find those months quite difficult. And one of the elements of that is uncertainty about what happens next and what it all means and where we go from there. So giving everyone the certainty of huge boosts in funding for the coming 4 years to get us to LA 2028 hopefully made these months that they're in now a little bit easier for everybody. But also, I mean, Tokyo did it really well. When they got the games, they looked from London 2012 ahead and said, we're going to make Paralympics our focus, 50-50 funding, and they went from 16 gold medals to 51 gold medals in the Paralympics for their home games in Tokyo. And if you think about the power of what our Paralympic athletes do and those stories that we hear and how they make you feel when you're in the middle of your average week dealing with the dross of your work and life admin, and then you hear about Alexa Leary or you hear about Curtis McGrath or Maddie De Rosario, the way it makes you feel makes all of us feel good. It helps all of us, helps our community. Sport makes you hug strangers. So we wanted to do everything we could to gather around that ideal, and just the idea that we could have 51 Alexa Learys, 51 Curtis McGraths, or 51 Maddie De Rosarios come Brisbane 2032 is why I love my job.
It is interesting to watch because if you look at, and I've nerded out on this a lot, if you look at host nations as they're getting closer and closer to the Olympics that they're hosting, their medal tally slowly increases. So if you look at the Olympic games preceding, say, for example, Sydney in 2000, Atlanta in 96, Barcelona in 92, the medal tally for the Australian athletes slowly increased as it got closer to Sydney, and then sort of tapered off. Same with Team GB. As they got closer to London, they started to win more gold. So I'm assuming what's happening is that these nations are going, oh shit, we've got the games coming up pretty soon ourselves. We need to get our act together. Is that what's was happening from our perspective as well? Because London, I was in London for the London Games. Actually, no, I was in Scotland and hanging out with all my family, which we're all going for Team GB, which kind of pissed me off because I'm going, you're Scottish, first of all, and this is basically England. And
Don't sell out.
Yeah, exactly. But no, they're all Team GB, and Australia was getting our ass kicked in the pool, and it was just really pissing me off. But looking at Team GB now, they're tapering off because London's now a distant memory. But now we're starting to gear up. I mean, is that what's happening both in for the Olympics and for the Paralympics as we get closer to Brisbane? That you as the Minister of Sport is now building with all of the various sports, building the foundations for us to have an incredibly successful Brisbane Games?
I hope so. It's something I like to, my sort of guiding principle as a politician is trying to be a good ancestor. Societies flourish when elders plant trees, the shade of which they may never sit under, that kind of principle. I might not have the honour of being the Australian Sports Minister at the opening of Brisbane 2032, but what I do now really matters as to how we go then. And I mean, the only reason we had the AIS was that we did so poorly in the Montreal Games that we said something's got to be done. So we established the AIS, which is now 40 years old, older than Josh and I. And we just pumped $250 million, biggest injection of funding since it was built, into the AIS this year to get it back up to world standard to help all of our athletes on the runway to Brisbane 2032. I think in a world where you could spend infinite money on Brisbane 2032, be it on the legacy infrastructure, the supporting transport infrastructure, the things that people in the private sector and the boost to the corporate world that people are looking for out of the games, I, as the sports minister, try and focus solely on the athletes because they're the people at the heart of the story. That's what makes the games come alive. And that's who the nation falls in love with when it comes to it during those 2 blocks of 2 weeks. So what do we need to do now to make sure that we all have the best Brisbane 2032 ever? The sequencing is really important. We've got to get AIS back up to scratch. We've got to get all of our high performance and participation pathways fit for purpose. We've got to get our talent ID programs going. We've just launched ours, but someone just last week was telling me about this new software that a particular private software company has where you can get anyone to run past the camera and they will tell you based on stride and form who will be great. And I was onto that like a right up a drain pipe because isn't that a great idea for our rural and remote communities, for our kids that don't necessarily have a school hall with a beep test going to be identified for Brisbane 2032. So as much as it's you could think about this, and we could do a breakaway podcast if you want, Stephen, to talk about it. As much as you could think about this every hour between now and Brisbane 2032, I'm trying to focus my efforts on the things that must be done 10 years out, 9 years out, 8 years out.
That's a big mistake that you've just made there, Anika, that you want to do a breakaway podcast on sport because I am taking you up on that. It may need to be a 6-parter, but we're going to do it. I do want to. I am going to. I have to move off the Olympics, but I have a couple of questions. I'm going to go back to you, Josh. Josh, what was your highlight for the Olympic Games?
Probably Jemima Montag. She was amazing in the walk, and I met Jemima afterwards. She's a local athlete who we had like a day at the VIS afterwards, where a lot of the local Olympic athletes came in and community turned up in this sort of day of trying things and trying equipment and running, and oh man, it was so cool to see the influence of these athletes on young people and the young kids who clearly looked up to them and saw themselves competing on the national stage and representing our country, but also the inspiration of actually wanting to participate. And I think that's that's clearly what drives a lot of this is the sort of positive role models of participating in sport is so good. I mean, there were some extraordinary performances, and I loved watching it. I was knee deep in the basketball, and rowing, track and field, and it was not a lot of sleep.
I'll tell you a funny story. When we got our very first VHS video recorder in 1984, and it was a top loader. It was silver. Didn't have a remote, but my dad, because obviously the games were in LA that year, my dad taped every day of the games. And for years afterwards, I would just keep watching it before the next Olympics. I could tell you pretty much what happened on every day of the 1984 LA Games. And that was my first introduction to the Olympics and how much I got hooked. And I haven't felt that excited about the Olympics. Obviously, Sydney was amazing and it was on our same time zone. But Tokyo was weird because of the athletes were running in mostly empty stadiums and whatnot, or competing in empty stadiums. But I just really got hooked again this year. I was getting up in the middle of the night to watch the swimming and all sorts of stuff. It was fantastic. Anika, back to you. Let's talk about politics of the Brisbane Games. We've now got a Conservative government in your home state of Queensland, and there was a lot of debate around about the stadium. And I just want to get a sense of what's happening there in terms of what are they going to do with the stadium? Are they going to who's going to have to make this call? Is it going to be is the opening ceremony and the athletics going to be at the Gabba? Are they going to build a new stadium? What's this? What is the new state government now that they've got to make a decision on some of these things? What's happening in that space?
Yeah, I don't think they know what they're doing. We've been doing a lot of tea leaf reading about whether they were coming to government with a plan that they were going to roll out the minute they got elected, that they were just keeping to themselves for the campaign, or what I think is what's actually happened. They didn't have a plan. And they've now just announced an expert panel to deliberate on all venues and report back to the Deputy Premier, which they're going to do in February. And the Premier, we just did this big event called Future Brisbane on Friday, which was at the three levels of government talking about Brisbane 2032. And the Premier got this big free clap off saying, we've got to take this out of the decision of politicians and give it back to the experts. But at the end of the day, that expert panel reports to the new LNP state government, who can set aside their advice if they choose to. So it's not clear to me what they're going to do. They certainly haven't let us in on their confidence yet. But that being said, something I learned in Paris is that the success of these games is going to come down to about 20 decision makers across the OCOG, the feds, the state, and the Brisbane Council. And we've all got to trust each other. We've all got to bunk in together and be collaborative. So I still live in hope that we will be able to do that as soon as we get some certainty in February.
Who has to take a leading role in that? Because that's coordinating all of those different organisations that you just mentioned and various levels of government. Like, whose responsibility to try and pull all that together?
Well, I think that's the difficulty at the moment. OCOG kind of looks after everything in the games that isn't venue infrastructure, transport infrastructure, etc. That is sort of as the state government is the host of the games. And that's why there was a separate body called Gavelda, which died a death at the election of the LNP government because they've now abolished Gavelda, but that was meant to be the independent venue and legacy board, which sat separately to OCOG, whereas OCOG reports to the IOC. The IOC obviously has very particular, and the international federations around the sports has very particular requirements of any venue, how things are run, etc. So basically at the moment, where all the chat is venue infrastructure, transport infrastructure, because that's at the remit of the governments. And also, like I was saying, in terms of sequencing, has to get underway in order for it to be ready in time. But as we get closer and closer to Brisbane 2032, the role of OCOG gets more and more important because they're the ones that control all the different elements of the actual running of the games. Again, I could talk about this all day, Stephen. We'll have to do a break off.
Yeah, absolutely. Gavelda, it sounds like a Yiddish cuisine.
R.I.P.
Okay.
I thought it sounded like Glinda, from Wicked. I always thought of it as Glinda. But anyway, the Good Witch of the East, is she the East? Gone. And a new body has arisen. It's got some, I don't know what they're calling it yet. The acronym's not easy.
No.
Geeka, something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know.
Parliament this year. Talk to us about Parliament. I want to get a sense of the highs and lows of what happened this year actually in the building. And I'm going to go to you, Josh, first of all. I mean, I just summarise some of the crazy stuff you had. Obviously, interesting things that happened, I should say. Senator Payman left the Labor caucus and has gone out on her own. We had Prince Charles, King Charles, this monarch from another country, come and visit our shores. And another senator, I think it was Thorpe, had some views in some ceremony. Even this week in the Senate, it looks like some crazy stuff going on. Let's talk about some of the highs and lows. What's some of the highs for you, Josh, first of all, and some of the lows or interesting moments of the chamber, and then both chambers, obviously, and then Anika, I'll get you to give us your reflections as well. But Josh, talk us through some of the highs.
I think some of the highs are those sort of moments that don't get a lot of publicity, where the Parliament does come together and actually tries to debate and have a conversation in a way that is respectful. And there have been some extraordinary contributions in the Parliament over the year, as there always are. I think when you look at the Middle East as a topic, it's that's sort of the example of the best and the worst of people trying to engage respectfully. There was a moment this year where we had a debate on the Middle East, and Ed Husick was down to speak for us, and he actually gave me his speaking spot because he wanted me to be able to have the opportunity to speak, and he took that moment not to scream and talk about his own point of view and all of the things that people often do in this debate, but actually to give someone else a chance who potentially might have a different view on it. I just thought that was a really, I'll never forget that. That was a really, decent thing for Ed to do. And sometimes Parliament can have these little moments where people are really considerate and are really honest and are really dignified. And I thought that was a good one. I mean, obviously there's been some things where Parliament has also been used as a tool to divide and really, I think have used these really emotive issues to try and pull people apart as opposed to hold people together, and that's something that I find really, really difficult. So Parliament, I think everyone would agree, Parliament under Anthony Albanese has been productive. There's been a lot of bills that have passed. There have been a lot of things that have been held up in this sort of new weird coalition between the Liberals and the Greens. Housing was unnecessarily delayed. This scheme that around helping people who get into the housing market on only a 2% deposit. That's actually in the Greens Party platform, but they voted with the Liberal Party just because they wanted to fight about housing for so long, and just meant that thousands of people weren't able to get into the housing market as a result of that piece of legislation stalling, and then eventually they realised that being stupid. So, Parliament, there's a lot of games going on. There's a lot of things that are productive, and certainly we're trying to use it in a way to help Australians, but there's a lot of characters in that building, Stephen, and it's a bit like herding cats. But I think on the balance of things, it's been used to do some really important things.
Fantastic, Anika. Some reflections from you about the highs and the lows of this parliamentary season.
I'd just like to make the point, as someone who observed federal politics for a long time before being elected to the federal parliament, that when you actually are working in the building, you miss far more than what you see. So these things that come out that are when these are sort of extraordinary moments, they're captured by the press gallery photographers or now on video. Most of the time, I want to say 95% of the time, you are in another room of the building doing something else, like what Josh says, something probably very worthy, something that's important for a different cohort of people. And like Josh says, if there's no conflict in it, totally ignored by the press gallery. So a lot of the things that you just listed off, I actually didn't see, and I only read about, like everybody else, in the media after the fact. It's actually not possible to to be present for all these different things that happen in a huge building with probably the most diverse parliament we've seen in the Federation, which is a bit, I must say, I feel like we miss out on it a lot. we get to see things and it's a real privilege, but we also do miss out on a lot. I remember just on Thursday, we rose for the year after the final question time. People were doing their valedictories, lovely moments of bipartisanship, probably not recorded more broadly in the media, but someone who worked with me, Bisma Asif, who just got elected as the first Muslim ever to the Queensland Parliament, was giving her first speech, and my office was all watching it, and I was in my federal parliament listening to valedictories. And it's just an example of just multiple important things happening at once where it's never possible to see everything at the same time. That being said, my highlight was the aged care reforms going through the federal parliament. Of course, I would say this, I'm the aged care minister, but these are the most significant reforms in 30 years. The Aged Care Act, as it was a John Howard 1997 era act. The Royal Commission, the number one recommendation was that we need a new act, a new rights-based act. And for aged care to be sustainable, we needed to put a lot more money into a system that needed a lot more money, and that required a huge amount of negotiation, a grand bargain from all parts of the sector, an agreement, a bipartisan agreement across the aisle, and that took a huge amount of work, nearly 3 years, in fact. And when we landed it, like what you were saying, there was a lot of conjecture in the run-up to landing a deal about the conflict of landing a bipartisan deal on structural reform in days where it feels like those things aren't possible anymore. And then we landed it and we introduced it to the Parliament, and the entire Parliament stayed to listen to my second reading speech as we introduced it. And I didn't know that was going to happen. So as I stood at the dispatch box, I saw that the PM stayed and the opposition leader stayed, and then 151 other members stayed and listened to what was probably a 25-minute speech about the importance of the aged care reforms and what they would do. And I tried not to wilt in the moment, because it's quite difficult when you go from thinking you're just delivering it to a chamber of 5 people like you normally do to the entire Parliament. I just tried to remember the people that along the way had fought so hard for this to finally happen, and it was really special and something that I'll always cherish.
Anika, can I ask you, I mean, you've been hanging around that building now for a number of years, because you were a staffer for a long time in
the
camp.
Rudd Gillard days, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that the chamber or the parliament in general has become less bipartisan and more a place for what's the word? You know how like you see this a lot in US politics, particularly in Senate inquiries, where it's an opportunity for a US senator to go on the front foot and maybe attack someone who they're questioning, to get like a viral clip. Do you know what I mean? Are we seeing more of that creep into the parliament here in Australia, or is this something that's just maybe being sort of curated by the media, and that's what's getting punched out, and that's what we're seeing? Because it seems to me that the place is less bipartisan to me, and it seems like there is a lot more sort of performative conduct by parliamentarians than it used to be.
I would add 2 pieces of analysis to that. One is that the press gallery is more depleted than ever before. They are stretched more thin. There are less journalists with less specific policy beats. There are less people trying to cover more, which means that their bandwidth is reduced. And if you are, like you're saying, a senator trying to make a name for yourself in a particular space, you have to be more bombastic to get the attention of these people who are genuinely time poor and unable to cover everything. So that's one element. And then I would say another element is that more than ever before, the media landscape looks different. So I don't have any local papers in print left. When I started nearly 6 years ago, I had 2 local weekly papers, both of which now only exist online within the News Corp umbrella, didn't survive COVID. So people have to, in order to get their own message out, diversify across different social media platforms, podcasts, not rely upon the mainstream media. So then you get a proliferation of what journalists kind of observe across those and choose to elevate. And both those different realities sort of interact with each other in ways that sometimes something that doesn't seem to be like a big deal becomes a huge deal, or something that should be a big deal doesn't get the attention it deserves.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, let's talk about our annual awards that we dish out each year. And Josh, I'm going to get you to go first, and then I'll get you to close out. Your MVP of the year or Federal Labor MP of the year. I don't know. We'll give it. We need to give it a name. And then secondly, Josh, your Social Democrat of the year. Yeah, over to you, Josh.
So honorary mention goes to Jodie Bellier, who won a very difficult by-election in Dunkley and did a fantastic job. And we also, like under the just absolute worst circumstances. And I really miss Peter, the member for Dunkley. She was a great friend and a great friend of both Anika and I, and a great person. We could have absolutely used her in all of the difficult things that the Parliament navigates through. But well done to Jodie. I think the Labor MP of the year. Obviously, Anika has done some extraordinary work on aged care and sport, but I want to give it to, but I can't give it to my co-guest. That's too cheap. But I want to give it to Jason Clare. I think he's done extraordinary work on policy front, where especially around removing student debt, lowering the HECS interest rates, wiping off student debt, and then also announcing our next phase of that, while also putting more money into universities, overseeing a policy to legislate minimum numbers of free tape. I think it's been a really good policy suite, and while also going through the University Accord. It is complicated universities. I'm currently doing some work in there as well, but I'm really proud of those reforms, and I think Jason's played a blinder on all of them. And then the Social Democrat of the Year, I would say that to bring Labor back to government from, was it 15 years in the wilderness in the United Kingdom, Sir Keir Starmer deserves that award. That was a remarkable election victory in a place where people literally were saying after the Corbyn eras that the Labor Party is dead, and there's never ever a pathway back to government for the Labor Party. Keir Starmer showed that is actually not the truth. And I actually wrote to Keir Starmer when he first got elected, when he was reforming the Labor Party, and he wrote back, and the letter still sits in my office right here, which I thought was a very decent thing for him to do.
That's cool.
So, yeah.
And your record time too. I don't think we had John McTinnon on a number of times throughout the years, throughout when Keir took over the leadership of the party, and John was predicting that he wouldn't get back in that next term, and they did. So that's quite a significant.
Tell John to just spruik up a bit, man.
I think he was hedging his bets. But anyway.
Yeah, classic John.
Indeed. Anika Wells, who is your Labor MVP of the year and your Social Democrat of the year?
Well, as I foreshadowed at the start of the podcast, today is actually the anniversary of me having to cancel on this podcast at the last minute for very secret and urgent reasons that took me at last minute to Canberra, which I'm sorry to say I still cannot reveal, but one day I will be able to reveal. So I had to attend to that, and then I had to fly home to get to my daughter's swimming carnival because I wanted to continue sleeping inside at our house. And along the way on that flight is actually also the 12-month anniversary of us losing Peter Murphy. And you never forget where you are when you hear sort of the most sorrowful news. So I'm actually awarding posthumously Federal Labor MP of the Year to Peter, because we're 12 months on. These jobs can be very difficult. These jobs can be outstanding, and these jobs can be very, very strange. And there hasn't been a single day in this job since we lost her that I haven't thought of Peter and thought, what I would give to be able to tell Peter what's just happened, or what I would give to hear Peter's reaction to what's just happened, or what I would give to ask Peter's advice, because she was the best in the business at this job. And 12 months on, I think her presence is still very much making a contribution to our thoughts and work of the Federal Labor Party. Social Democrat of the Year, I am giving to, again, I teased this earlier for keen listeners, the Australian Paralympic team, because this has been a rugged old year for a lot of people, a lot of dark times, but sport makes us want to hug strangers. And the Paralympic team, I mean, sport's very bombastic. Just to sidebar into sport policy for a second, sport is very bombastic. All sports have their thing. They've got the biggest participation of under 14s. They've got the biggest participation of people whose house faces west, who were born under a Sagittarius moon. Like, everyone's got their thing that they are best at. And the Paralympic team has the greatest connection to Australians, measurable, which I think is an extraordinary thing. And when you think about the values that we as progressives want our society to hold, which is equality, opportunity, inclusion, lifting our spirits, working together, overcoming obstacles, resilience, I think the Paralympic team espouses all of those values. And I think, like I said, personally, I want to do as much by them as I can to make sure that we all benefit from their success and everything that they've given to us.
Fantastic.
Back to you, Stephen.
Wonderful. And I'm assuming, Anika, given you're giving them the Social Democrat of the Year award, you'll be signing them all up to the Labor Party as well. That's great.
If I would, I could. I'm about to write them some letters, actually. I might pop it in as a PS.
Do it. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for today's episode, Josh and Anika, to reviewing a great year. Obviously, there's so much more that we could cover in our hour, but we had to pick and choose a couple of things we wanted to talk about. And I want to both you and your families, I want to wish you a wonderful summer break. Hope you get plenty of time off and go to the beach or do the things you want to do to decompress and get ready for what will be an incredibly important year for federal Labor in 2025, because we're going to have an election and we need to get re-elected so we can continue to do the good things that you guys have been doing for both your local constituencies but also the Australian public. So to Josh Burns, happy Hanukkah, and hope you have a great break, mate.
Merry Christmas.
Lovely. And to you, Anika Wells, hope you have a great Christmas and a great break over the summer as well.
Happy Australia-India Test Series and happy Women's Ashes to all who celebrate.
Well, good stuff. Always on message. Love it. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.